Hi, and welcome to The Lamp in the Library. I'm Graham.
I'm Kim.
And today we're going to be talking about hunkering down.
Yeah, cloistered living.
We're looking at two very different books about the concept of cloistered living. And obviously this has some resonance at the moment because the world has, for a year, been under, more or less strict stay-at-home orders.
Yeah. And we currently are living in another lockdown order where we are, so it felt like a good time to talk about books that look at staying in one place.
So I read a book actually about a month before the pandemic first hit, and because it was getting a lot of buzz, and it's called My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. And this is a fascinating book. It's essentially the story of a young woman who decides to stay inside her apartment for an entire year. So this obviously has resonance during the pandemic. So the protagonist in this story, her parents have passed away, they left her an inheritance, and she decides to just hunker down, and with a combination of prescription drugs and sleeping, to essentially hibernate and to stay asleep for as long as possible over the course of a year in order to reset her life and change the way she's thinking about things. And that's what she sets out to do. Kind of a narcissistic anti-hero of a character, but I think this book really resonated with people even before the pandemic, because who hasn't fantasized about, hunkering down for a period of time? The whole concept of Netflix and chill. There's so many ways that we can just stay behind closed doors these days and kind of turn inward. And this is very much a character who has done that. But obviously there is some very added resonance during the pandemic, and in fact sales of this book went up during the pandemic as people felt it resonated for obvious reasons. So even though this is kind of like an extreme example of the concept of cloistering or hunkering down, I thought this was an excellent novel. It has a lot of kind of metaphorical resonance. But there's this narrative momentum to the book that's quite fascinating. Despite the lethargy of the protagonist, it's kind of a page turner of a novel. It's a really fascinating concept, and I think it's executed excellently. So I highly recommend this book, My Year of Rest and Relaxation.
Do you think that, is one of the reasons why she decides to isolate herself from the world to deal with her grief? Or is it just tired of everything, want to shut down sort of thing?
Yeah, it seems to be a mixture of both. It's her mental state, I think. And I think that's part of why this book has resonated with a lot of people. And maybe the work itself came out of the fact that there's political instability in the world, there's climate breakdown, there's all these large problems even before the pandemic that seem unsolvable, and there's this desire on the part of a lot of people to just kind of tune the world out and turn inward. And I suspect that's part of the impetus for the author writing this book, and it's certainly why I think it has captivated so many people.
Well, my book that I'm deciding to discuss is much more of a literal cloister, because it deals with looking at a specific monastery and the nuns that live there. It's the novel In This House of Brede by Rumer Godden. It was published in 1969. Rumer Godden is probably best known for her work Black Narcissus, which has been adapted to the screen a couple of times. I haven't seen or read that book, but it's really interesting because in the introduction, the author shares what inspired her to write this novel, and it had to do with some time she was spending with a specific order of nuns, because she was dealing with a personal crisis in her life, and she got to know them, and then she heard once one of the nuns remarking that she wished there was a book or media that really showed what the reality of being a nun was like, as opposed to a more romanticized vision of it, or perhaps one that's more just the horrific side of it. And the author notes that she blushed because she thought of her book Black Narcissus. So I'm hoping to read that soon, and it will be interesting to sort of contrast the two, because I think Black Narcissus might be a little more of like a romantic idea with like, oh, temptations there with like between men and women. So anyways, this book itself sort of loosely follows one woman who's a very successful businesswoman who leaves her position and the world behind to suddenly join a specific order of nuns. And it's a great shock to the people who are in her life. And when she's there, you see what life is like within those cloistered walls. You meet a lot of her fellow sisters and you learn about their lives. And then throughout the length of the novel, you're seeing how the different nuns that you get to know throughout the book, how they interpret the notion of having a vocation, what brought them to be within the cloistered walls, and then also just the difficulty of living in such a communal space. While you are limited and cloistered in where you live, it's also a communal space, so you're always seeing those same people, and how do the personalities adjust to each other? How do they support one another? What happens when there's tension between them? So you see all that play out. There's also just the, real world things they have to deal with, like budgets and money, and a big part of that has to do with it because they're not so outside of the world that they don't have to deal with things like a budget, especially the abbess. So I thought it was a really interesting look at that sort of life, and I appreciated that sort of look at various people's interpretation of vocation. And while it's a turning away from society, it's a turning away from society to be in service. At least that's the way that they interpret it. So I thought there was a lot to chew on when reading this book, and I read it really quick. I found it very much a page turner too, because you slowly get to know these characters. So you're slowly learning their backstory and sort of figuring out what brought them there, what brought them to the doors of this monastery and to enter in. So I definitely highly recommend it if it's something that sounds like you'd be interested in.
Yeah, so this book sounds like it's an interesting contrast to My Year of Rest and Relaxation, in that you've got two protagonists who maybe come from a similar worlds, similar backgrounds, but there's a rejection of the outside world to turn inward. But the joining of a monastery, you're essentially joining a new society. And, there's that interaction with people. And even though you're cloistered behind walls, there is still that interaction with the outside world. Whereas the protagonist of My Year of Rest and Relaxation, certainly rejecting the outside world, but really turning inward and rejecting all forms of society. So very contrasting visions of what it means to hunker down.
Yeah,
I suppose.
And I think one of the reasons why the nun that she speaks of in the introduction spoke about having the reality of it is that maybe sometimes people think of having like that vocational life, a religious life, as one of just total inward contemplation all the time, but it's not, because there's such a regimented schedule and it's so involved with other people that I bet you a lot of times they wish they did have more time for contemplation than they do.
Yeah, whereas the protagonist in My Year of Rest and Relaxation, like self-reflection and contemplation is not part of it all. She's rejecting, the thoughts. She's either asleep in a drugged state, or she's binge watching, bad 80s movies, or middlebrow 80s movies, to kind of, not have to think about the world. To basically numb herself. Yeah.
So if you've read either of these books or are interested in it, please comment below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe below, and hit the bell so you always know when we have a new video.
Yeah, let us know what you're reading and if what's getting you through the shutdown. Are you cloistering? What entertainment do you recommend while cloistered?
Yeah.
And keep well.
Keep reading.